Oh boy. Things have just gotten very, very interesting, and I wanted to open up 2025 in terms of the Detroit Red Wings with some trade talk. Why not? It's a hot topic right here. Today I wanted to turn your attention to the After the Whistle podcast. This is a show run by ex-NHLers Andrew Peters and Craig Rivet, presented by Sennecke Buffalo. Now, I'll be very clear here, this video was not presented by Sennecke Buffalo, just the podcast After the Whistle is. And the reason I say the sponsor that they have is because it's very apparent from listening to the After the Whistle podcast to reading the After the Whistle podcast Twitter account and even looking at the players that are hosting the show that this is a very Buffalo-based product. Andrew Peters played most of his career in the early 2000s with the Buffalo Sabres. Craig Rivet spent some time with Buffalo too. He actually was the captain of the Sabres in the late 2010s. Now, Rivet did spend the majority of his time elsewhere. Montreal specifically stands out to most fans watching this player, but Rivet and Peters are on this podcast. The show is presented by Sennecke Buffalo, and if you look at their tweets, they talk about a lot of Buffalo Sabres stuff. So I would assume that if we're thinking about the Buffalo beat, we're talking about Buffalo Sabres related content. These guys probably know what they're talking about, right? Ex-NHLers, especially those who were the captains of this team, probably do have some level of authority when it comes to talking about what's going on. And so, when they tweeted this out yesterday, it kinda got everybody up in arms. This had 50,000 views, and the tweet says this: "We've been told Detroit wants Cozens. No info on what the return would be. Happy New Year." And I love it. It's so chaotic, evil energy to just go out there and drop, hey, by the way, the Red Wings want this top-tier player. Bye! And then just peace out, go do whatever it is you're doing for New Year's. By the way, Happy New Year. While this show on YouTube is not sponsored by Sennecke Buffalo, it is sponsored by ExpressVPN, so if you do have any VPN needs, use my link in the description. It's the top link there, and get yourself some VPN action going on. You get some savings, and also it helps me out a bit if you take some time to use that link. But to hear that Detroit is involved in the Dylan Cozens conversation, firstly, I wanted to talk about the legitimacy here, because obviously I think a lot of people that have been following the Wings for the past few years have cemented this reputation in their minds that says that Steve Yzerman and his circle, they're a vault. All of these guys, they're a vault. Not Franklin, Trevor, or Michael could ever break into it because it's so sealed tight. Every piece of Detroit Red Wings information, what they want, what they have, it's all sealed, and nothing usually leaks out into the media, right? I feel like over the past few years that reputation has started to get challenged a little bit, especially with some of the extra tidbits of info we've been seeing here and there from renowned NHL insiders, but for Rivet and Peters to go out there and talk about this on their own Twitter account, it's interesting because you recognize that this source is not Detroit-based. It's from the other side. It's two former NHL Buffalo dudes who are sponsored by a Buffalo company who usually talk about the Buffalo Sabres, tweeting out that the Buffalo Sabres have a guy that the Red Wings apparently want. It's a very particular difference in terms of the rumor here. It's not a leak from Detroit per se, it's more so an idea maybe spread around there in the Buffalo area. So I don't want to go out there and immediately claim lies, especially since, of course, the podcast is run by two NHL players. No reason to believe that people in this position would make anything up at this point, especially when it comes to a name like Dylan Cozens, a 23-year-old, 6'3", 194-pound right-handed center, the workhorse from Whitehorse, who is signed on till 2030, making $7.1 million a year. He's making a lot of money because 2 years ago, at the age of 21, he posted up a 68-point and 81-game season. Fan-freaking-tastic. Last season, he dipped to 47 points in 79 games played, which was seen as kind of okay because everybody else in Buffalo also dipped in points. It wasn't just Cozens, it was Dahlin, it was Thompson, it was Alex Tuch. Everybody kind of had down years in Buffalo in 23-24. Cozens, though, he still had the benefit of the doubt. He was over a point per game for Team Canada at the World Championships that year. This season, however, things have not really been going all too well for Cozens furthermore. He's got 19 points in 37 games, on pace for 42 points, so yet again another decline in point production compared to last year, although this season things in Buffalo have taken kind of a turn for the worse. They did have a really bad losing streak, but there are some other guys who have started to actually produce more. Tage Thompson is kind of back on his horse, and I say kinda. Alex Tuch has been producing still, Jason Zucker's come out here, and Rasmus Dahlin, even though he missed a good sample of games, has been exploding offensively this season. Dylan Cozens is going the opposite direction. And so now when you think about the fit, things haven't necessarily been working out for him all too well. There have been rumblings about a trade. We'd already discussed the idea of the Vancouver Canucks being interested in him because Elliot Friedman decided to drop that bomb on his 32 Thoughts podcast earlier last year. But when you think about Dylan Cozens and the profile that he is, I feel like Detroit is almost perfect. Not in terms of the situation. I don't know necessarily if the Red Wings would be able to bring the best out of Dylan Cozens, if Todd McClellan has what it takes to make him an effective, let's say 60, 65 plus point NHL player whilst providing good two-way value. But when it comes to the guys that Steve Yzerman tends to like, I mean, Cozens fits the bill, right? Hardworking, two-way, defensively minded center who's got skills, who's got physicality, who's got a shot, and who can score some pretty nice goals once in a while. Everybody talks about the fact that the Red Wings drafted almost the same guy 3 years in a row in the first round, with Marco Kasper, Nate Danielson, and Michael Brandsteg-Newgard. And there was criticism with these picks because you could debate that the Red Wings left off some of the higher-tiered, higher-ceiling talent on the board in order to take these more stable two-way guys. Now, you can say what you want about Marco Kasper. He's been doing pretty well this season. But the same question still has to be asked. Did you take Kasper because he was the safest option, or did you take Kasper because he was the guy with the highest ceiling? And I think the answer doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be something else entirely. If the Red Wings go out there and target and maybe even acquire a guy like Dylan Cozens, I start thinking about the exact same thing. I'm like, hey, Cozens, Brandsteg-Newgard, Danielson, Kasper, these guys are almost the same player. Cozens maybe has a little bit more snarl and a little bit more size, but ultimately these guys are all sort of in that same mold. I'd also argue that Cozens has the highest offensive ceiling out of those three, but maybe things have changed a little bit since Cozens is no longer, close to his draft-eligible year. I mean, he's 23 years old now, drafted back in 2019 after all. You have to remember back in that time frame, people were saying that Cozens had this, 80, 85 point ceiling. He was so dominant in the WHL and then at the World Juniors. He was so good, and he was the captain of Team Canada in his rookie year with the Buffalo Sabres. There was a lot to like out of Cozens, and so thinking about the progression, it's kind of unfortunate to see things go down this way, but now it's opened the door to a bunch of other teams that might be looking at him and saying, hey, we still want to believe in the potential here. We think we can bring more out of you. And if Steve Yzerman is that guy to make it done, well, I will say that I do kind of believe more in the ceiling of Cozens rather than the ceiling of a MSB or maybe even a Nate Danielson at this point, not because any of those guys are bad prospects, but because we've already seen out of Cozens that he can be a 60-plus point guy. He had a 68, near 70-point season at 21 years of age. So there's reason to believe that Cozens is going to get better. It's just been a pretty bad stretch for him in Buffalo the past year and a bit that unfortunately has subjected him to the idea of trade rumors popping up here and there. So if you're a fan of the Detroit Red Wings, I want you to let me know your thoughts. Firstly, what do you think a Dylan Cozens-like asset could cost? There are a bunch of people in the replies of the After the Whistle podcast tweet going over a whole bunch of different scenarios. No, you're not trading Andrew Kopp for Dylan Cozens. That's not working. You're going to have to include some pretty high-profile, notable names. You've got Mo Seider, you've got an Ed Vincent, you've got maybe even a Raymond, which is totally unrealistic, but you're gonna have to include somebody. One guy, and then add some picks and prospects to see if it works out, because Cozens still does have a lot of value here. If you trade away like a Kasper or something for Cozens, you do Casper plus some extra stuff. Honestly, I feel like that's a pretty lateral move, but I feel like Marco Casper has been one of the guys that's been a lot better as of late too, so maybe you don't want to necessarily make that move. Anyways, if you're a fan of the Wings, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about Dylan Cozens and this entire idea of the Wings wanting him, and what do you think about the reporting that's been going on here too, where it's a Buffalo Beat reporter podcast going out there and laying the smackdown. Thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Sign on. And bye.